Stop interrogating me about my plans. My wife Sarah snapped when I asked about her Friday night. I said, "You're right." So I stopped asking, and stopped sharing my location. She went crazy when she found out I'd spent the weekend in Seattle, carefree and silent. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts sooner, but when you've been married for 6 years, you tend to give your spouse the benefit of the doubt. I'm Kevin, 32, an architect at a mid-sized firm downtown, and until a month ago, Sarah and I had what I thought was a solid marriage built on trust and open communication. We met in college, dated for 3 years, got married in a small ceremony that her dental hygienist salary and my starting architect income could actually afford, and settled into the kind of comfortable routine that most couples dream about. We shared everything: Netflix passwords, bank accounts, weekend plans, even our locations on our phones, because it just made practical sense when one of us was running late or stuck in traffic. The change started subtly about a month ago. Small shifts that individually seemed innocent but collectively painted a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. Sarah began closing her tablet when I walked into the room, something she'd never done in 6 years of marriage. Her phone, which used to sit casually on the kitchen counter while she cooked dinner, now lived in her purse or pocket, screen down and always within arm's reach. The dental office where she worked as an office manager suddenly required a lot more overtime, particularly on Friday nights, which struck me as odd since I'd never known dental practices to schedule emergency administrative work for weekends. When I'd ask casual questions about her day, the same questions I'd been asking for years, her responses became vague and slightly defensive. "Just the usual stuff, you know how it is," she'd say, turning back to her phone instead of sharing the small details about difficult patients or office drama that used to fill our evening conversations. The most jarring change was her sudden need for privacy during phone calls, stepping outside or into the bedroom with whispered conversations that ended abruptly when I appeared. Last Tuesday night, while we were folding laundry together in our usual companionable silence, I made what I thought was an innocent comment about our weekend plans. "So what's your Friday looking like? Want to try that new Italian place downtown?" I asked, shaking out one of her scrubs. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. "Why do you always need to know everything I'm doing? Can't I have any privacy without you monitoring me constantly?" The words hit me like a slap, partly because they were so unexpected and partly because they revealed a resentment I hadn't known existed. I stopped mid-fold, holding one of my dress shirts, and studied her face. This wasn't just irritation about restaurant choices. This was something deeper, something that had been building while I was completely oblivious. "I'm not monitoring you, Sarah. I was asking about dinner plans. You ask about everything: where I'm going, who I'm with, what time I'll be home." It's suffocating. The accusation stung because it was so unfair, but as I watched her angry face, I realized something important. She wanted space, and she was going to create conflict to get it. Fine. If that's what she needed, I could give her exactly what she asked for. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly, resuming my folding. "I should respect your privacy more." The relief that flashed across her face confirmed my suspicion that this conversation wasn't really about my questions. It was about creating justification for whatever she was already hiding. That night, while Sarah showered, I opened my laptop and began researching flights to Seattle, a city I'd always wanted to visit but never had a good excuse to explore. If my wife wanted privacy and independence, I decided I'd claim some for myself. I booked a red-eye flight for Thursday night and a waterfront hotel room for the weekend, using my personal credit card and creating a small adventure that would give her all the space she seemed to crave. The irony wasn't lost on me that her demand for privacy had just given me permission to disappear completely, and as I closed the laptop and listened to her humming in the shower, I felt the first spark of excitement I'd experienced in weeks. Thursday evening arrived with Sarah announcing she'd be attending a dental conference dinner that would run late, perfect timing for my clandestine departure to Seattle-Tacoma Airport. I packed light, just a weekend bag with casual clothes and my camera, and called an Uber while she was getting ready in the bedroom, applying makeup with more care than usual for what she claimed was a professional networking event. "Don't wait up," she called out cheerfully as she left, keys jingling, and I almost laughed at how perfectly our deceptions were aligning. The red-eye flight was surprisingly peaceful, and I spent the journey reading about Seattle's coffee culture and waterfront attractions, feeling more anticipation than I had in months. When I landed at dawn and caught the light rail into the city, watching the skyline emerge through the train windows, I experienced something I hadn't felt since the early days of our marriage, genuine excitement about the day ahead. Friday morning in Pike Place Market was everything I'd hoped for, the energy of vendors setting up their stalls, the smell of fresh fish and baked goods, street musicians tuning their instruments for the day's performances. I bought coffee from 3 different vendors, not because I needed the caffeine but because each conversation with the baristas felt refreshingly honest and uncomplicated. No hidden agendas, no careful word choices to avoid triggering defensive reactions, just simple exchanges about beans and brewing methods that reminded me what normal human interaction felt like. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since 6 p.m. the previous evening, but I deliberately left it in airplane mode, savoring the silence. Around noon, curiosity finally got the better of me, and I powered it on while sitting on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay. 23 missed calls from Sarah, 14 text messages, and 7 voicemails greeted me in a cascade of notifications that made other tourists glance over with concern. The progression of messages told a fascinating story. The first few were casual inquiries about my whereabouts, followed by growing confusion, then irritation, and finally something approaching panic. "Where are you? Your car's not in the garage." "Kevin, this isn't funny. Call me back. I'm really worried now. Did you go to work? Your office says you took a personal day. Where the hell are you?" I deleted all the voicemails without listening and sent one simple text, "Taking some personal time. Back Sunday." Then I turned the phone off completely and spent the afternoon exploring the Space Needle and taking a ferry ride to Bainbridge Island, marveling at how peaceful life could be when you weren't constantly checking for signs of your spouse's mood or whereabouts. Saturday brought more adventures, hiking trails in Discovery Park, browsing bookstores in Capitol Hill, sampling craft beer at a brewery where the bartender recommended local bands and the conversations flowed as easily as the IPAs. Every moment reinforced how much tension I'd been carrying without realizing it, tension that had become so normal I'd forgotten what relaxation actually felt like. That evening, at a jazz club tucked into a basement on Pine Street, I found myself genuinely laughing at the basis between song commentary, and it struck me that I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed without calculating whether Sarah would find it amusing or annoying. The music was smooth and unpredictable, the whiskey was excellent, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself rather than someone carefully managing another person's emotional landscape. When I finally powered on my phone Sunday morning to check my flight status, the message count had grown exponentially. Sarah had clearly enlisted friends and family in her search efforts, because now I had concerned texts from my sister Emma, my college roommate Mike, and even Sarah's mother asking if I was okay. The desperation in Sarah's latest messages was palpable. "Kevin, please just tell me you're alive. I'm going crazy here. Whatever I did wrong, we can fix it. Just come home." But what struck me most wasn't her panic. It was my complete lack of urgency to reassure her, an absence of guilt that told me more about the state of our marriage than any argument could have. Sarah's desperation had escalated beyond simple worry into full-scale detective work, and by Sunday afternoon, she'd apparently called everyone in our shared contact list trying to locate me. My sister Emma texted me directly. "Sarah called 3 times asking if I knew where you were. She sounds really panicked. Everything okay?" Followed by messages from college friends I hadn't spoken to in months, all forwarding Sarah's frantic inquiries about my whereabouts and mental state. The irony was delicious. The woman who demanded privacy and accused me of monitoring her was now conducting a surveillance operation that would make the FBI proud. I spent Saturday evening at a cozy jazz club in Capitol Hill, nursing excellent whiskey and listening to a bassist whose improvisational skills reminded me why I used to love live music before our social life became dominated by Sarah's preferences and scheduling constraints. The music flowed unpredictably, conversations with strangers felt genuine and uncomplicated, and for the first time in months, I experienced what it was like to exist without constantly gauging someone else's mood or adjusting my behavior to avoid conflict. When I finally sent that single cryptic text, "Taking some personal time, back Sunday," and powered off my phone completely, The silence felt like a luxury I'd forgotten existed. Meanwhile, what Sarah discovered during her frantic search efforts was revealing in ways she probably didn't expect. I'd been more private lately than she'd realized, and our mutual friends knew surprisingly little about my recent activities, interests, or state of mind. Mike later told me that when Sarah called him in tears, demanding to know if I'd seemed depressed or mentioned feeling trapped, he'd been forced to admit that we hadn't had a real conversation in months. She kept asking what you'd been up to lately, and I realized I had no idea, he said. Made me wonder what kind of friend I'd been. But Sarah's panic wasn't just about my physical absence. It was about the sudden realization that she'd been so focused on creating space for her own secrets that she'd completely lost track of my inner life. During my Saturday afternoon ferry ride to Bainbridge Island, while Sarah was presumably tearing apart our home looking for clues about my destination, I made a decision that would change everything. I hired a local private investigator. The decision came to me while watching the Seattle skyline from the ferry deck, and I found Harold Kim's contact information through a simple Google search for Discreet Investigation Services Seattle. His office was in Pioneer Square, and he agreed to meet me that evening at a coffee shop near my hotel. I need to know what my wife is actually doing while I'm out of town, I explained, sliding him a photo of Sarah and the address of her workplace. She claimed to be at a dental conference dinner Thursday night, but I suspect that's not true. Can you monitor her activities until I return tomorrow? Harold was professional and non-judgmental, quoting me a reasonable daily rate and promising photographic documentation of Sarah's movements. Most of my marital cases involve suspected infidelity, he said matter-of-factly. What specifically triggered your suspicions? I outlined Sarah's recent behavioral changes, the secretiveness, the defensive reactions, the sudden need for privacy after 6 years of transparency, and Harold nodded with the weary recognition of someone who'd heard this story many times before. Classic pattern, he confirmed. The projection is usually a dead giveaway. When someone starts accusing their partner of being controlling or invasive, it's often because they're feeling guilty about their own deception. He promised to begin surveillance immediately and send me a preliminary report by Sunday evening. As I walked back to my hotel that night, past couples holding hands and friends laughing over dinner, I realized that hiring Harold wasn't about confirming my suspicions, it was about taking control of a situation where I'd been reacting rather than acting. Sarah had demanded privacy to protect her secrets, but she'd inadvertently given me the freedom to uncover the truth while discovering what my life could look like without the constant anxiety that had become our normal. The investigation would either confirm my fears or put them to rest, but either way, I'd know exactly what I was dealing with when I returned home Sunday evening. I returned Sunday evening to find Sarah pacing our living room like a caged animal, her face a mixture of relief and rage that shifted rapidly as I walked through the door carrying my weekend bag. Kevin, where the hell have you been? I've been going crazy for 3 days, she started, but I held up my hand and calmly set down the manila envelope Harold had delivered to my hotel that morning, an envelope containing photographic evidence that would end our marriage. Before you say another word, I said, settling into my favorite armchair with the detached composure of someone who'd spent 3 days processing the inevitable, I think you should see what I received this morning. Harold had done excellent work, clear photographs of Sarah entering the downtown apartment building of Dr. Marcus Thompson on Thursday evening, the same night she'd claimed to be at a dental conference dinner, followed by images of them having intimate dinners at upscale restaurants I couldn't afford on my architect's salary, walking hand in hand through Pioneer Square, and kissing in the doorway of his building on Friday afternoon while I was exploring Pike Place Market. The timestamps on the photos told a story that contradicted every explanation she might offer, and the expression on Sarah's face as she rifled through them was worth every dollar I'd paid Harold. This isn't what it looks like, she began, but her voice lacked conviction, and I could see her calculating how much she could admit versus how much she might still hide. Kevin, Marcus, and I are just friends. He's been helping me through some emotional stuff, and these photos make it look worse than it is. The classic deflection, exactly what Harold had predicted she'd say when caught. Sarah, there are photos of you entering his apartment building at 8:30 p.m. Thursday and not leaving until 6:15 a.m. Friday. That's either the longest dental consultation in history or you're lying to me. She sat heavily on the couch, the fight draining out of her as the reality of being caught with irrefutable evidence settled in. "It's not physical," she whispered, which was such an obviously desperate lie that I almost felt sorry for her. "We just talk, and sometimes I fall asleep on his couch because he makes me feel understood in ways that I don't." I finished calmly, pulling out my phone to show her the contact information for Jennifer Park, the divorce attorney I'd researched during my flight home. "I have an appointment tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. You can join me if you want to discuss division of assets, or you can find your own representation." The shock on her face was complete. She'd expected tears, arguments, demands for explanation, maybe even a dramatic confrontation where she could play the victim of my controlling behavior. Instead, she was facing a man who'd used her demand for privacy to discover the truth and plan his exit strategy with the same methodical approach I brought to architectural projects. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "We can work through this. I'll end things with Marcus immediately. We can go to counseling. This is just a rough patch and, Sarah, you called me controlling for asking about dinner plans while you were sneaking off to another man's apartment. You demanded privacy to cover your affair, then spent the weekend terrorizing our friends and family because I took you at your word and gave you space." I stood up, feeling surprisingly calm given the magnitude of what was happening. "I'm not interested in counseling someone back into wanting to be married to me." Her desperation escalated quickly from there, cycling through every manipulation technique in the cheater's handbook. Tears about how she'd made a terrible mistake, anger about my vindictive investigation, guilt trips about throwing away 6 years of marriage over one mistake, and promises to be completely transparent going forward. But sitting in that jazz club in Seattle, listening to music that flowed without agenda or calculation, had reminded me what peace felt like, and I wasn't willing to trade that clarity for the anxiety and suspicion that would define our relationship from now on. "I spent 3 days in Seattle," I told her as she sobbed into her hands, "and I felt more like myself than I have in months. That's not something I can unsee or unfeel." The conversation lasted another 2 hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. Harold's photographs had simply confirmed what my gut had been telling me for weeks, and Sarah's betrayal had inadvertently freed me to build the life I actually wanted rather than the one I'd been settling for. Within a week, I'd moved into a downtown loft apartment with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Elliott Bay, hiring professional movers while Sarah was at work to avoid another emotional confrontation that would accomplish nothing except prolonging the inevitable. The apartment felt like freedom, sparse but intentional, furnished with pieces I actually liked rather than compromises we'd made for shared living, and quiet in ways our suburban house had never been despite Sarah's frequent absences. Jennifer Park proved to be exactly the kind of no-nonsense attorney I needed, someone who reviewed Harold's evidence with professional detachment and assured me the divorce proceedings would be straightforward given the documented infidelity. "Affairs make property division much simpler," she explained during our first meeting. "Washington is a no-fault state, but adultery often influences spousal support decisions, especially when there's clear evidence of deception." Sarah's attempts at reconciliation became increasingly desperate as the reality of my departure sank in. She showed up at my new apartment twice in the first week, once with homemade chocolate chip cookies and a teary apology about how she'd lost herself and needed my help finding her way back, and again with printed articles about marriage counseling and statistics about couples who'd overcome infidelity. "Kevin, we can rebuild this stronger than before," she pleaded during her second uninvited visit, standing in my doorway like a door-to-door salesperson peddling hope. "People make mistakes, but that doesn't mean we throw away everything we built together." But what we'd built together was already gone. It had crumbled the moment she decided Marcus Thompson was worth more than our marriage vows, and my weekend in Seattle had shown me what life looked like without constant vigilance against betrayal. The legal process moved efficiently once Sarah realized I wasn't bluffing about the divorce, though her attorney made a half-hearted attempt to claim emotional distress damages based on my abandonment during the Seattle trip. Jennifer demolished that argument quickly, pointing out that taking a weekend vacation hardly constituted abandonment, especially compared to carrying on a 6-week affair with a colleague. Sarah signed the papers on a rainy Thursday morning in November, exactly 2 months after I'd returned from Seattle with evidence of her deception. Meanwhile, my daily routine had evolved into something I genuinely enjoyed rather than endured: morning runs along the waterfront before work, evening cooking classes at a culinary school near Pike Place Market, and weekend photography expeditions around the Pacific Northwest that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with architecture in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on me that Sarah's affair had forced me to rediscover interests and passions I'd gradually abandoned during our marriage, hobbies that had been slowly sacrificed to accommodate her social schedule and emotional needs. I bought a high-quality camera and spent Saturdays capturing the interplay of light and shadow on Seattle's buildings, finding artistic inspiration in the same city where I'd first experienced freedom from marital anxiety. My work performance improved dramatically once I was no longer distracted by suspicions about Sarah's whereabouts or mood. I completed projects ahead of schedule, volunteered for challenging assignments, and even received an informal commendation from my supervisor for the innovative design solutions I was contributing. "You seem different lately," my colleague David observed during a lunch meeting. "More focused, more confident. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What I was doing was living authentically for the first time in years, making decisions based on my preferences rather than carefully calculated attempts to maintain domestic harmony with someone who'd been planning her exit strategy while I was planning our future. 6 months post-divorce, my life had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined during those tense final weeks with Sarah. I'd been promoted to senior project manager at my firm after successfully leading the renovation of a historic downtown office building, bought a craftsman house in the Fremont neighborhood with a workshop space for woodworking, and developed a passion for exploring the Cascade Mountains with my camera every weekend. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase and the kind of creative autonomy I'd always wanted, designing sustainable housing projects that actually excited me rather than the generic commercial buildings that had been paying the bills. My new house was everything our suburban place had never been: character, history, and space for the hobbies I'd rediscovered during my post-divorce renaissance, including a basement workshop where I was learning to build furniture with the same precision I brought to architectural drawings. I encountered Sarah entirely by accident at the Fremont Whole Foods on a sunny Saturday afternoon while buying ingredients for a dinner I was cooking for my photography group, and the complete absence of any emotional reaction surprised me more than seeing her did. She looked tired in ways that went beyond simple fatigue: thinner, pale, wearing the kind of casual clothes she used to reserve for sick days, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that suggested she'd stopped caring about the appearance that had once been her primary focus. "Kevin," she said softly when our eyes met near the organic produce section, her voice carrying none of the confidence or entitlement I remembered. "You look really good. Happy." I felt nothing except mild curiosity about how different she seemed, the way you might notice changes in an old college acquaintance you ran into after years of no contact. "Thanks," I replied simply, continuing to select vegetables while she lingered nearby like she wanted to say more but couldn't figure out how to start a conversation with the man whose life she'd derailed. The interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds before I moved on to the deli counter, and driving home, I realized I rarely thought about our marriage anymore except when filling out forms that asked about marital status. Through my photography hobby, I'd met Lisa Chen, a freelance travel writer who shared my love of capturing the Pacific Northwest's natural beauty and who communicated with the kind of direct honesty that made every conversation effortless. We'd connected at a photography workshop focused on landscape composition, bonded over our shared appreciation for early morning light and the challenge of capturing weather patterns, and gradually developed the kind of friendship that felt natural rather than forced. Unlike my relationship with Sarah, which had required constant emotional navigation and careful word choices, conversations with Lisa flowed organically whether we were discussing technical camera settings or sharing stories about our worst travel disasters. She appreciated my methodical approach to planning weekend expeditions, laughed at my terrible puns about f-stops and depth of field, and never made me feel like my interests were boring or my personality needed adjustment. When I invited her to join me for a weekend photography trip to the Olympic Peninsula, she suggested we split the gas and hotel costs equally, a gesture so refreshingly straightforward that it reminded me what partnership was supposed to feel like. On the anniversary of my original Seattle escape, I took another solo trip to the city, But this time it was purely celebratory rather than reactive. I stayed at the same waterfront hotel, revisited Pike Place Market and the Jazz Club in Capitol Hill, and spent hours photographing the skyline that had witnessed my transformation from anxious husband to contented bachelor. The trip felt like closing a circle, acknowledging how far I'd traveled emotionally since that desperate weekend when I'd fled to reclaim my sanity and discovered a life worth living. 1 year later, I reflected on how Sarah's explosive demand for privacy had inadvertently freed me from a marriage that had become a prison of anxiety, suspicion, and walking on eggshells around someone who was already planning her escape. Her affair with Marcus Thompson, while painful at the time, ultimately saved me from years of slow-burning unhappiness in a relationship that had died the moment she chose deception over communication. I'd learned that true partnership requires transparency and mutual respect, qualities I now enjoyed with Lisa as our relationship naturally progressed from photography partners to something deeper and more meaningful. My Seattle trips had evolved from desperate escapes to joyful adventures, often shared with Lisa, who appreciated both my independence and our growing connection, understanding that my solo travels weren't about avoiding commitment but about maintaining the sense of self I'd almost lost during my marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that Sarah's betrayal had been the catalyst for every positive change in my life. The promotion, the house, the hobbies, the genuine relationships, and most importantly, the quiet confidence that came from knowing my worth and refusing to settle for less. I'd claimed the freedom Sarah had demanded for herself, but I'd used it to build a life based on authenticity rather than secrets, surrounded by people who valued honesty over convenience and partnership over control. When Lisa and I took weekend trips now, we shared everything, expenses, planning, even our locations with each other because transparency felt natural rather than invasive when you had nothing to hide. My phone no longer buzzed with desperate messages or accusations. My evenings were filled with genuine conversation instead of careful diplomacy, and my future looked bright rather than uncertain. Sarah's final gift to me had been showing me exactly what I didn't want in a relationship, clearing the path for me to find what I actually deserved, and I'd never been happier or more grateful for a betrayal that had felt devastating but turned out to be liberation in disguise.